Toxic masculinity. Never in their wildest dreams could our ancestors have guessed that their descendants would come up with such a concept, both incredibly reductive in its semantics and impossibly oxymoronic in its implications. We have seen in part 1 that the very notion of deeming portions of masculinity as irredeemable was an invention of modernity, used by our contemporaries to label the whole concept as toxic. In truth, their work of segregation is unfair, and has led to more harm than good. By separating between good and evil, modern society has presumed to isolate the germ and keep only the virtue, and in doing so, has allowed for the destruction of the entire architecture of masculine cultural standards, leaving modern men fatherless, both literally and figuratively. This also permitted real toxic masculinity to go unchecked and threaten our society, something that the people responsible for the deconstruction of male archetypes failed to understand. I will seek to correct their mistake by trying my hand at the Manichaean exercise of discerning between positive and negative masculinity, using the show Grappler Baki as allegorical background, with Yujiro as main focus, to prove that toxic doesn't equate bad, and that without its shadowy counterpart, neither masculinity nor the word would exist at all. In his book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell summarizes the hero's journey to a series of archetypal myths that come to define societies and the way we understand and interact with our environment. By this token, he creates a link between nurture and culture. If epic literature centers its development around deeply rooted psychocultural mechanisms, it isn't just to showcase them, but also to reinforce their influence through written tradition, so as to make sure the future generations would never be deprived of heroism. Male identity, as is the case in every single culture on Earth, was developed thus, via masculinity that gave birth to its standards, which themselves perpetuate it. Art imitates life, and life imitates art. Such is the cycle of male power fantasies. Any text offering a rendition of the hero's journey works to reinforce this dynamic, and Grappler Baki is no exception. At its core, it is a very classic monomyth, the plot essentially being the tale of a boy trying to gain the approval of his father. Because the story of Baki is in manga form, it is light in narrative weight, forcing the author to convey his message through symbols. For those who cannot access this subtext, the first arc of Grappler Baki remains impenetrable. That very same allegorical penchant can be observed in mythological texts, caused by a certain tendency our elders had of never clearly outlining what it takes to be a hero, preferring instead to offer fictional journeys as live-action tutorials for us to learn from. By doing so, forefathers refused to reduce masculinity to a list of tenets or a black and white painting. Instead, they offered stories, leaving the spectator free to build his own understanding of the experience unfolding before his eyes, as prior knowledge of the standard is vital to replicate it. This purely cultural understanding of male archetypes isn't fully complete, as these cultural norms were formed first and foremost through biological drives, with gender and social standard being equally as important in the expression and development of masculine traits, the former stemming from the prior, as the cultural always inevitably finds its source in the hormonal. However, the point still stands that for male identity to make the jump from the purely cellular into the societal, a background of shared wisdom was needed. Hence the existence of myths and male power fantasies. In these, symbols are carried through delineators that often take a bicephalic shape, that of obstacles for the hero and conveyors of meaning for the reader. This is where Yujiro comes into play, as this is his true nature. I've said in a video that you can find in the description that Yujiro Hanma wasn't human. In it, I explained that his nickname of Ogre was more than a moniker, and that it actually captured his essence as a being of destruction, but also of creation, as it is his cruelty that gave birth to Valor. I will not go over these elements again today, but I greatly encourage you to keep this point in mind, as it will be the crux of my argument. When looking at Grappler Baki's cast of characters, it is immediately evident that one of them stands out from the rest, and unlike what you might think, it isn't Baki himself. Rather, it is his father who dominates the world in which the story takes place, to the point that he can be described as being the god of this universe. I'm not using that term in the Abrahamic sense, since monotheist religions tend to have a more metaphysical understanding of the figure of the creator, in opposition with polytheist cults where anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism ally to create divine figures that, while not entirely human, are still far from being pure spirits. In that aspect, they can interact with us in our realm, hence why Greek and Roman divinities often served as foes to overcome for mortal heroes. Baki assuming the role of protagonist, with Yujiro serving as main antagonist, is in direct line with that tradition, and explains why the entirety of the first arc is constituted of Yujiro railroading Baki into acting exactly the way he intends him to, forcing the hero to surmount his janitor's challenges. This process is so effortlessly carried through minimal narration that most people don't even realize that the entirety of the first half of Grappler Baki is really the symbolical journey of a boy who has to face a god in order to become a man. This omnipresent father-son relationship carrying the plot is just a vehicle to present a sinister coming-of-age story, where toxic masculinity becomes the main reason for the development of virtuous masculine characteristics, as the ogre puts Baki through the gauntlet. In this sense, Yujiro doesn't represent masculinity, but its shadow, hence why every male character in the series seek to fight and best him, and always fail to do so, as wiping out nefarious masculinity is as inexpugnable a paradox as trying to kill death. If you managed, then it would just mean that you would now have to take the place of Yujiro, as the world needs its boogeyman. This is a common trope in mythological texts, while the true source of evil is presented as inextinguishable. Since no human can hope to destroy the matrix of turmoil or obstruct its source of resurgence, chaos is free to serve as an agent of change for the rest of eternity. Grappler Baki fans often fail to notice symbols, leading to many events appearing silly to them. For example, the moment when Yujiro stops an earthquake with a punch, which is often interpreted as an over-the-top expression of his physical power. It isn't. It's simply the sign that he is not human. He is an archetypal god, and as such, he has the power to control the universe. Another one of these instances that confuses many is the moment of Yujiro getting caught by a net, then sent to sleep by Tranquilizer Darts. An event that appears incoherent only if you take the story at face value, and refuse to consider the subtext. Before getting trapped and snoozed, the ogre was getting ready to slay every single participant in the maximum tournament. To prevent that, he had to be removed from the premise. If you understand the tournament as an allegory of life as a male, and Yujiro as its challenges, it makes total sense, as this perfectly illustrates the duality of masculinity. It creates emulation for men to become stronger, but it also constantly threatens to end their lives. This explains why he was moved into a separate room instead of simply killed. Masculinity is a chaotic energy that can be tamed temporarily but never destroyed, both its positive and negative pendants being essential to the existence of the universe as a whole. As such, its darkness cannot be erased, only temporarily gelled. You should start to understand by now why the very notion of labeling toxic masculinity as bad is ridiculous. Too much of it certainly is, but its outright absence would result in the destruction of masculine energy as a whole, leading to a cultural landscape where the only survivors would be remnants of masculinity virulent enough to resist the assault. This is akin to putting pesticides in your garden to kill bugs, only to find out that you poisoned the birds that were keeping them in check instead. A metaphor that only makes sense if you look at masculinity as a force seeking to find equilibrium within itself, with one side represented by heels and the other getting championed by heroes. The chaotic side is similar to a force of nature sourced from the most primal of biological drives, and the other is a cultural guardian that seeks to channel this chaos into something beneficial for humanity. This also means that regardless of their efforts, the useful idiots of modernity will never be able to get rid of the most violent and problematic aspects of masculine identity. At best, they can keep them at bay for a while, but their resurgence in the gene pool is inevitable, confirming the idea that the only barrage to this constant stream of disorder is to be found within masculinity itself. Axiomatically, the modern approach to this issue is therefore neither appropriate nor needed, as the solution to toxic masculinity was never to be found in deconstruction, but rather in the creation of foundational virtue via male power fantasies. If toxic masculinity is the power to destroy, then positive masculinity is the power to build, which paradoxically is only made possible by the very existence of this threat of destruction. In conclusion, you cannot get rid of toxic masculinity, just like the wood of Baki cannot get rid of the ogre. Remove him, and everything falls apart. He represents that which is governed by instincts, facing those who are governed by reason. If you ever wondered why everyone but Yujiro uses distinct martial arts, this is why. The only form he assumes is that of the hyper male, a figure not to be confused with the alpha male. One represents the pinnacle of masculinity, the other is masculinity. Here is an important distinction to grasp, as those two archetypes fulfill drastically different roles. If we were to look at mythology again, most times the figure of the villain is a representation of the hyper male, whose characteristics stem from disorder and seek to invoke chaos. In opposition, the hero often possesses all the traits of an alpha, whose purpose is to create order. This aligns with our very understanding of social hierarchies, who have always been masculine systems at their very core, with ranks being cultural standards stemming directly from power relations that dictate who dominates and who submits. These social constructs go back to caveman days and have been preserved and propagated by ancient mythological texts, for the benefit and protection of the entire human race. Historically then, the role of the man who ascends to the top of masculinity is to create structure, and in doing so, he naturally opposes the serpent of chaos, whose power hinges on the absence of rules. Distinguishing between the two can be complex, as they are after all the sides of a quickly flipping coin. But simply looking at the way Itagaki depicts Yujiro is enough to grasp their nuances. At no point does the ogre seek to create strong opponents for the sake of society. He does it purely for selfish gains. But regardless of his intent, the result is the same. His existence as a hypermale stimulates competition and motivates the rise of stronger masculinity. The same way that nature motivates the evolution of the species by relentlessly challenging it. In a sense, this is why no one can beat Yujiro. The role of man isn't to eradicate masculinity, but to utilize it for the furtherment of mankind. This explains also why none of the ogre's provocations turn Baki evil. A response to toxic masculinity can only be virtuous, or else it only reinforces its matrix, making it a zero-sum game, opposing nature and culture with no definitive victor. By way of consequence, since the hero cannot be malignant himself, he can also never come to truly hate his fighter, despite the abject mistreatment he was subjected to. A tenderness that the ogre also reciprocates in the rare moments when he isn't devouring his environment. The relationship is eerily similar to the one between Zeus and Hercules, which itself was traced after the dozens of texts depicting similar stories of men confronting supernatural allegories of masculinity. An opposition that never takes the form of outright antagonism, as the father and the son are still united in their masculine identity. The same can be said for men's relationship with toxic masculinity. Most of us can feel intimately that this deconstruction that is imposed on us is not to our benefit, since what nurtured us into becoming vibrant males is this very energy that modernity is attempting to erase. This apparent sympathy for a torturer is a puzzling concept to grasp for a generation that was raised on positive reinforcement alone, as they cannot understand that there could be merit in borderline traumatic educational experiences. Don't get me wrong, Yujiro is indeed a terrible father, but not because he doesn't take care of Baki. If anything, he is too overbearing. By constantly pushing his son to be better through negative reinforcement alone, he greatly damaged Baki's mental health and threatened his identity. However, we can also attest that refusing to expose a kid to any negativity whatsoever can be just as harmful to his development. When looking at it from a purely binary perspective, it is often the role of the father to expose the offspring to challenges, and the role of the mother to comfort them and make them feel safe. This is why Baki's childhood was so unbalanced. Both his parents were trying to get him to surpass his limits without ever taking a moment to nurture his inner child. This symbiosis between masculinity and femininity deserves a longer dissection, but for today, let's just say that toxic masculinity is always the result of an imbalance, either caused by a lack or overabundance of its own substance. Yujiro is filled to the brim with masculinity, to the point that his very existence both triggers and forbids the creation of masculine individualities around him. As opposed to an alpha who serves in the construction of a society based on structures of hierarchical domination, in which the perpetuation of leadership conflicts lead to the perenniality of the group, Yujiro both invites and disallows this changing of the guard. he constantly seeks and creates conflict, while at the same time never allowing himself to lose. And because of that, the only form of nurturing he can offer is through violence. Think of it as the difference between a democracy and a tyranny. The true democratic leader doesn't necessarily want to lose his reign on power, but his political DNA dictates that he will step down if the collective chooses. Meanwhile, a tyrant will hold on to power no matter what, creating two diametrically opposed reactions in their opposition. To replace a leader, you have to best him, and to replace a despot, you have to kill him. Maybe this is why progressives dislike toxic masculinity so much. Since they hate any outward expression of authority, it also includes iterations that create virtuous identity through opposition, which explains why they embrace the notion of social determinism, while continuously rejecting any interpretation of it that doesn't lead to self-victimization. But for us, who see the concept in its globality, it has become obvious that the very existence of authoritarian energy is what gave birth to our freedom, which is therefore contingent on masculinity. This is why Baki had to emancipate himself from the ogre to finally become his true self, and why father-son relationships are often at the center of male power fantasies. Defending masculinity through political analysis is essential, as it clearly demonstrates that the presence of violence within our culture has always been a building block which, beyond the instability it brings through latent menace, has also allowed us to elevate ourselves beyond the station of savages. Yujiro, because he is more beast than man, allows for civilization to flourish around him, as he constantly threatens its destruction, which explains why the majority of Baki fighters are perfect gentlemen, who only partake in violent behaviors when facing each other. Any character that doesn't follow this formula always falls under the umbrella of the hypermale, and they are unsurprisingly also always antagonists. Taking the political angle reduces the attack on toxic masculinity into nothing more than a witch hunt. Mankind has always managed to regulate its dark side, and this process only started to get compromised with the advent of modernity. Manhood is both a sword and a shield, with the former being a cultural response to the biological challenge posed by the prior. And since the spirit of chaos exists as a cyclical entity that will never leave this world, its societal counterpart will always be needed as well. And now you are starting to understand why the agents of progress are coming after toxic masculinity. What they resent is nature itself, and they are perfectly willing to commit civilizational suicide if it means taking it down with them. Grappler Baki's first arc finishes on a similarly grim note, with Yujiro killing Baki's mother. Symbolically, the meaning is twofold. Firstly, it represents the victory of the hypermale over incomplete masculinity, with chaotic violence creating disorder that will force the hero to restructure both himself and the world, resulting in a metaphorical death whose effective price was paid by his mother, as her inability to create a defender caused by the failure to nurture the son that would have played that role led to her inevitable doom. That's our second meaning. When the spirit of chaos runs rampant, it starts by claiming lives left unprotected by masculinity. As such, it is those that are the most vulnerable to violence that should champion it with maximum vigor, something that ancient femininity understood but that modern women have forgotten. Blinded that they are by a patriarchy that has exaggerated their protective privilege to such an extent that they have stopped feeling the threat of the serpent, and are now welcoming it in their bosom. Meanwhile, those that would have protected them from it are targeted and taken down, leading to the following open conclusion. It is women that give birth to their greatest perils, due to their inability to understand the mechanisms of their own safety. Toxic masculinity has always been the greatest ally of femininity, because it permitted the creation of cultural shields designed to protect them. With modernity now having confused these screens for a wall, the very people who benefit from the system most are trying to break it down, ignorant of what they are going to invite inside. As a man, it is your responsibility to oppose this movement, and to preserve the masculine energy and strength we need to defend our own.